Did you ever wonder why we call them books of the Torah if it's all in one book?
No.
Yeah.
Never gave it a
Are you willing to think about it now?
Now that you bring it up.
So we call it Sefer Bereshit, Sefer Shemot, Sefer Vayikra, Sefer Bamidbar, and Sefer Devarim, which means the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy, because they were at one time separate volumes. The original way that the Torah was written and kept in the archives of ancient Israel was each book was on a separate scroll.
That makes some sense because a whole Torah scroll is pretty large and heavy.
It certainly can be, and actually modern Torah scrolls are heavier than old Torah scrolls. Interestingly enough, modern Torah scrolls are often backed with a special covering in order to make them, partly more aesthetically appealing because it gives a more smooth backing to it, so it's a little bit more plain, and it whitens out the irregularities that come with skin variations in the animals. So now, when we write a Torah scroll, we sew together all the books. So it's one continuous Torah. But in the ancient world, you would have had a volume for Bereshit, a volume for Exodus, a volume for Leviticus. You would have had 5 scrolls. And so therefore, you would have really reached for a separate book when you wanted to look something up. So even though we've now merged them all into one, and even though when we print them, we almost always print them together, unless we're printing with commentary, in which case sometimes it gets so large that we divide them into different volumes, we end up with one book, but we call it a Sefer. Each one is still a Sefer. So we are now in Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, which can be found on 769 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. 769.
Well, we want the very beginning of
We want the chapter 1 of Numbers, which is on the handout. It mentions on the handout that we're going to, for a change, look at the first chapter of the parasha. As you know, we often move around a little bit. Today we're going to be looking at the very first chapter.
I see.
Okay, we all on the same page? Good. Look at your handout. Now that we're all on the same page, look at something different. Because we're actually going to start off with just a little bit of a reference to something all the way back in the book of Genesis. All the way back in the beginning, as we say. So who'd like to give us a little bit of creation? It's a short paragraph, so don't be shy. Edie, why not?
God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth.
Okay. Both with this quote, as well as other quotes throughout the Tanakh, we learn what about the sun and the moon?
What day they came out?
We learn what day they came, yes.
God made
them, yes.
between light and dark.
Well, partly, yes, in fact. Well, what do the sun and the moon do?
They rise and set.
They rise and set. Well, what are they supposed to do here?
Give
Give light. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Is the moon a light source?
Well,
Yes.
from our current scientific understanding,
Yes.
no, not directly.
Correct. Therefore, science is wrong or Torah is wrong. Let me underline the problem here, as has been raised by some modern theologians, primarily not within the Jewish circles, but if the hypothesis goes, if you take the Torah, the Bible, as being true, if you take it literally as being true, if the Bible says the moon gives light, the moon gives light. And any scientific evidence to the contrary must be mistaken, must be in error. On the other hand, the other side of the argument goes, from the new atheist organizations and groups, if we know the moon doesn't give light, if we know instead that the moon reflects light from the sun, if the Bible says the moon gives light, the Bible must be wrong. And this proves that the Bible, therefore, cannot be divinely inspired by any omniscient entity. Because if we're going to claim that God is omniscient, then God should know what even the youngest school child knows, which is the moon reflects light. It's a giant mirror. It's not a lamp. So we have two implacable options. Either we have faith in the inerrancy of the Bible, that the Bible is always true, and reject modern science, or we accept modern science and reject the truth claims of the Bible. Isn't that a fun position to be in?
Oh, and there's no middle ground, no
Cool.
compromise.
Where would we find middle ground? I mean, it's black and white.
We can accept both.
No, the moon often looks yellow or red.
It's not always black and white. Very good, very good.
Well, reflective light is still light.
Reflect, but it doesn't say. It says gives light.
Reflection gives light.
So you're saying
If
there's...
you were in a dark place, and there was something in there that was reflecting light, it wouldn't be dark anymore.
So you're saying that there is room for interpretation? Are you saying that you don't want to read the Bible literally?
No.
No, you're not saying that, or no, you don't want to do
No,
that?
I don't
There's
read
room
it
for
literally.
interpretation, I would say.
But does interpretation then become apologetics? Apologetics is the term that's used for an academic or scholarly argument that tries to overcome the criticisms of religion. So whereas we might have been more than happy to say the moon gave off light for the last 2,000 years, when modern science discovers that the moon doesn't give light but reflects light, we suddenly change our tune and now talk about the moon reflecting light and reinterpret this phrase. Well, that's often criticized as just being apologetics. Meaning, you change it every time something comes up that's inconvenient. And that's just being weaselly. And there are those among the more, they consider themselves faithful of the religions, that say if faith means anything, it means believing something despite every evidence to the contrary. And it becomes a badge of honor. To be willing to believe something that the rest of society labels as imbecilic becomes a matter of pride. It shows the depth of your faith that you are willing to believe something ridiculous. And only the ones without faith would bend just because of empirical evidence.
So don't we have the same thing with creation, the two beliefs?
Well, this is creation. This is just a small
Well,
slice of
but
it, yes.
The very beginning of
Okay, so what we're going to look at today is another issue, another problem. One that is slipped past most of the time when we're reading from the Torah, because it's boring. It's from the book of Bamidbar, which in Hebrew means in the book of the wilderness. But in English, what do we call this book?
Numbers.
Numbers. And why does it get that name?
Because it's full of
Because it's full of them. Because it's full of numbers. It's full of counts and censuses, and it just goes on and on and on. But in those censuses, I believe is the official plural, we're going to hopefully uncover a little bit of an insight that might help us understand this other question of faith and reason and interpretation, apologetics, literal, and all of those good topics. Okay? We're on the same page? Okay. Who'd like to do a little bit of reading now from chapter 1 of Bamidbar, page 769? Any volunteers?
All right.
Okay.
On the first day of the second month, in the second year following the exodus from the land of Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting, saying, "Take a census of the whole Israelite community by the clans of its ancestral houses, listing the names, every male, head by head. You and Aaron shall record them by their groups from the age of 20 years up, all those in Israel who are able to bear arms. Associated with you shall be a man from each tribe, each one the head of his ancestral house."
Okay. What did we just say?
They're going to
God ordered Moses to count the number of men of age to be soldiers.
To be aged that are fit for military duty, as you might say, that they would be willing or able to go up and to bear arms, to be part of the cohorts of Israel in a military manner. Make sense?
Right.
Why? Why does this make sense here?
Because they're going to have military operations and they need organization.
Okay, so let's talk about the timeline. What are we dealing with here? We just read it in the very first verses. What's the time that this census is taking place?
Sinai.
It's at Sinai, but a very special time at Sinai.
The first day of the second.
Okay, so it's the first day of the second month, which is,
In the second year.
don't say February,
Yeah.
ER, exactly. So it's the first day of ER in the second year.
The second month.
Well, the second month is ER.
Okay.
Because when the Torah counts months, what's the first month?
Nisan.
Nisan, which is the month that we left Egypt from.
Right, this is when Passover is in. Yeah.
What's that? And that's where Passover is in Nisan, exactly. So that's the first month whenever the Torah is talking about months, and the second month is ER. So we're on the first of ER in the second year. And in fact, where we are is we are getting ready to leave Mount Sinai. We got to Mount Sinai. When? I'll give you a hint. We were
The
counting.
year before that,
Elmer.
it was
Okay, we left in Nisan, right? In the
Yeah.
first year of our Exodus. And we arrive at Mount Sinai and receive the Ten Commandments on what holiday? Shavuot. We actually arrive a few days before that because there's a little preparation that goes on. But we arrive in Shavuot, which is, we get the Ten Commandments in the Torah, Shavuot, which is how many days after Pesach? 50. We count 49 days, and the 50th day is Shavuot, exactly. So the 49 gap in between, so we're talking 50 days later. So that's in the third month, also known as Sivan, of the first year. That's when we get to Sinai. Now we're getting ready to leave Sinai. To go where?
heading toward Israel.
Exactly. Yay, Israel. We're getting ready to go to Israel. And how long is it going to take us to get to Israel?
40 years.
How long do they think it's going to take to get to Israel on this day? Not how long do we know it takes. What is the anticipation at that moment? Has the decree come down that it's going to take 40 years to get there? No. When does that decree come?
Only after they've spied it out and decided not to enter.
Absolutely. Only after the Meraglim, after the spies come back with the negative report, to put it diplomatically, and all the people say, oh, woe is us, there's no way we're going to be able to do this. That's when God says, fine, you're going to sit here for 40 years, not wander, despite all the wonderful phrases that made it into the English idioms. We're not wandering for 40 years. We basically move from a few places and camp for 40 years, waiting for people to die. Once they're dead, then we go in to the land of Israel. But right now, they don't know that yet.
What kind of people are you talking about dying? Moses or generation?
The generation. So it's basically everybody who will have been included in this sentence, the 20 to 60-year-olds, they need to die before Israel goes in. And they don't know that yet. So at the moment, they believe Israel is a few weeks away,
Right.
not 40 years away. Because after all, when you're at Sinai, Israel ain't far. Even on foot, Israel is not far. It's, about 50, 60, 70 miles. That's not a long walk. You go more slowly when you have a caravan than you do when you're just a lone hiker, but still, we're not talking about a long trip. So why are they making the census here?
They start somewhere.
Well, think of what we already mentioned, but now put it into the immediacy of the context.
If we're looking at military,
Mhm.
we're probably going to go through hostile territory, and we're certainly going to have to attack the natives in the land of Israel.
Okay. This is preparation for invasion. The census that is being described here at the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, of the book of Numbers, is preparation for invasion. They are getting ready for the immediate task of moving through potentially hostile territory, although we try to make good overtures to all the people that we're just passing through. But it's still potentially hostile and turns out to be hostile in many cases. We're preparing to march through that territory and settle the land of Israel in a matter of weeks. We need to know how many guys we got. We need to organize them so they know which banner to stand behind and where to rank and file and get their spears and swords and everything ready. This is a very concrete purpose. It's not just an abstract, I wonder how many guys we got here. We are mustering the troops for an immediate invasion.
So it sounds like, in a sense, they're not just counting the number of troops. It's the beginning of organizing them into an army.
Absolutely. Now here's the problem. When was the last census?
Pardon, what was that? What?
When was the last
When
census?
was the last?
When did we first count the Israelites after leaving Egypt? I'll give you a hint. It's in the chart on the handout. After Yom Kippur, which is the 9th month of the first year. So we arrive on the 3rd month. We go through all of the 40 days up, come back down, 40 days up a second time, the building of the Mishkan, well, the sin of the golden calf, the building of the Mishkan, all that good stuff. And according to rabbinic calculations, the census that is described in chapters 30 and then the total being done in 38, which is the half shekel census, is done about after Yom Kippur, in our first year of Exodus. That's great, right? But if that's done in Yom Kippur, which is the 9th month, and Iyar is the 2nd month, then, wait a minute, we're only looking at 9 to 12 is 3, and 3 to 2 is 5. We're only looking at like 5 months ago. 5 months ago they did a census. And now they're doing another census. Wait, did they forget? Why in the world is the Torah giving us a second census 5 months after the first census?
Well, what was the
I mean, I know
census
Jews
on?
like to be accountants, but come on.
What did
Question?
we count the first time?
What did we count the first time? Well, we counted the people through the process of shekalim, of the half shekel tax that was being levied for the support of the Mishkan, in particular that was used for the silver for the sockets of the poles that made up the Mishkan.
Was that the same group, though, that the census was done?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So now we're going to get into our interpretations, our different explanations for this apparent redundancy, this apparent stupidity, is how many people describe it. I mean, do they really think that the people who are reading the Torah are so, numb from having gone through the book of Leviticus, which many people consider boring, although we all know now it's not boring, but they think that everybody is bored, that they don't realize that when it says they do a census in the first day of the 2nd month, that we're only talking about 5 to 6 months after the last census. Do they really think that people aren't paying attention? Come on, the Torah must have been put together by different people. This is obviously a separate count, a separate story of how the Israelites were counted. This proves that the Torah is not a unified book, that it wasn't written by one author. Because no single author would make such a bonehead mistake of saying that they're going through the whole process of counting again. And as we see through the commentary, there's going to be a second problem that crops up in this as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's see how Rashi goes ahead and tries to handle this. Who wants to play Rashi for the day? Begins with, we cannot say that this census. Yes?
Okay.
Okay.
We cannot say that this census
The one in Shemot, the one in the book of Exodus.
is the one described in Bamidbar.
So, first proposition Rashi is trying to rule out, don't say that the Bamidbar census and the Shemot census are the same. They're not the same census being described twice. They must be separate censuses.
For we are told there, on the first day of the second month, while the Mishkan was established on the first day of the first month, and from this counting, the sockets were made from those
Shekalim, the silver coins.
Alone. In other words, there were two countings, one in the beginning of their contributions after Yom Kippur in the first year, and another in the second year of Iyar. When the Mishkan was established.
Okay, so he's pointing out, look, it says that they counted them and weighed them out for the sockets, and that we know had to be done by the big book of Leviticus, because in Leviticus we talk about using the Mishkan. And then after Leviticus, we start talking about the census in Bamidbar, the one that we're now talking about maybe being military in style. Therefore, they must be two separate countings. So now we've really driven it home, according to Rashi, two separate countings. But here's the problem. Or second problem, I should say.
And if you say, is it possible that both censuses Israel numbered the same 603,550?
Okay, remember a long time ago, back in the fall, when we were reading the section in Exodus, we talked about the census then. We talked about the counting. And we came up with this figure, 603,550 people. Well, men of 20 years and older. But the problem is the census in Bamidbar is exactly the same. So if you have two censuses, even 5 or 6 months apart, what's wrong with them both being the same total?
Some weren't of age.
What's that?
Some of them weren't of age, I guess.
Some of them weren't of age. What about the guys that were, 19 and have become 20 in the last 5 or 6 months? I mean, someone had to be born between these years during their birthday had to come. Didn't we sing Yom Haledet Sameach to anyone? We didn't sing happy birthday to a single guy and all of the 600,000 people? There must have been somebody who moved up. And what's the other option?
Some died.
And there are some that moved down, more or less literally. Somebody must have passed away. So then we're left with the option that
Balanced.
those who moved up and those who moved down must have been the same. Yeah, sure. Well, let's see how Rashi handles that.
The two censuses took place in 2 different years. It is impossible that there were not 19-year-olds who were not counted in the first census, who would have been 20 by the time of the second.
Keep going.
The answer is that in terms of the ages of the people, both censuses were conducted in the same year.
I got to follow this logic.
But in terms of the time elapsed since the exodus from Egypt, the census took place in 2 different years. Because the exodus from Egypt is counted from Nisan, as we learned in
Masechet.
Rosh Hashanah.
Shana. It shouldn't be 2 S's, sorry.
Oh, Rosh Hashanah, okay. The Mishkan was built in the first year and established in the second. For a new year started on the first of Nisan. But people's ages are counted according to the years of the world, starting in Tishrei. Thus, both censuses took place in the same year. The first was in Tishrei after Yom Kippur, when the Holy One was appeased and forgave them
For the golden calf.
and commanded them to build the Mishkan, and the second took place in the first year
On the first of Iyar.
of Iyah.
Exactly. All right, everyone follow that, or do we need a little timeline?
That means we don't everybody's birthday is celebrated on the 1st of Tishrei?
That's what Rashi's hypothesis is that we have 1 year being counted biblically, which is Nisan to Nisan, and those are the years of Exodus. So we say the first year of our Exodus, the second year of our Exodus, the third year of our Exodus, and that goes from Nisan to Nisan. Nisan 1 to Nisan 1, in fact. Right. So the question then becomes, when it comes to birthdays, it actually goes from Tishrei to Tishrei, says Rashi. And since we know that they did the first census on Yom Kippur, which happens after Rosh Hashanah, after the 1st of Tishrei, so somewhere along in here, therefore, before we get to the next Nisan, we hit 5-6 months down the line, the next census, which means we haven't gone through another cycle for birthdays. So even though we have gone through a second cycle of Nisans, we haven't gone through a second cycle of Tishrei, so they don't quite overlap perfectly. Therefore, lo and behold, the numbers are the same because nobody's had a birthday, because birthdays are only counted at Tishrei.
That still doesn't explain if nobody died.
Well, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't explain why nobody died, which was the second half of our difficulty with that interpretation. And as we're going to see, there are other people, other commentators, that argue against this solution as well. What's one of the most obvious arguments against this solution that you would just instinctually think? Well, nobody died, but even if let's not talk about that. Let's say there was a magical miracle and nobody passed away, but we know people are aging. Well, nobody born, they have to get old enough to hit that threshold. And they're already arguing that the birthdays wouldn't have counted because birthdays are only counted from Tishrei. Birthdays are only counted from Tishrei? Really?
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
But, do you ever remember on Rosh Hashanah the rabbi saying, "And happy birthday to everybody because now you're all a year older"?
Haven't heard it.
Haven't heard that. Huh. Well, maybe it's just us, liberal rabbis. Maybe it's just the liberal rabbis that aren't doing that. Well, let's go ahead and see what Ramban, Nachmanides, says about this. So who would like to be a medieval Spaniard? Oh, Christine, thank you.
I am astonished. How could there be such a large congregation without there being some deaths in half a year, some hundreds and even thousands? According to Rashi, during this period, about 7 months, no one died, but it is written. And there were some people who became impure through contact with the dead.
All right, we're going to find out in just a little bit that people definitely did die, because how else could they have come up with the issue of impurity from contact with the dead? Mm-hmm. So Ramban is first attacking Rashi for his assumption that nobody must have died by saying, but the Torah says somebody died because you can't become impure from contact with the dead without someone being dead. That's kind of automatic.
Yeah.
Moreover,
I have another question. A person's year are not conducted according to the years of the world from Tishrei, but rather each according to the date of his birth.
carry on.
Therefore it is said of them, from 20 years and upwards, that they should have had completed 20 whole years. And likewise, in any place where the Torah counts a person's years, they are counted from their individual dates. As we learn in the
Masechet
Arachim,
Arachim.
this is beginning the case. All those born between Tishrei and Iyar had meanwhile completed a year, and many new people should have been recorded in the new census.
All right, so Ramban throws us back into the fire. Because he says, no. We know that people died. And Rashi, where in the world did you get the idea that people only count their age from Rosh Hashanah, from Tishrei? We know from Arachim, which happens to deal with the topic of last week's discussion. Remember the Erech vows? Remember we were talking the vows of the value of a person? Remember a little bit from last week? And we talked about the different age categories for the different amounts. Well, in the Talmud, when it talks about your age, guess what it uses to determine your age? Your birthday. It doesn't use Rosh Hashanah. It uses your birthday. So the Talmud and the Torah seem to believe that your birthday measures your age, not Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah measures the age of existence for everything, not your birthday. Your birthday is your birthday, and you measure your age with that. So Ramban is basically taking the solution that Rashi gave to our problem and knocking it apart. Which means, of course, he has to do what now?
Now he has to come up with an
Now he's got to come up with an alternative. Because the commentators are good at that. Unlike many modern politicians, they don't simply attack an opponent's position. They have to provide an alternative to the same dilemma, to the same problem. Because they're not denying that there is something that is a little out of whack here. They just need to figure out why it's not out of whack. Okay?
It is more probable that what had happened. At the first census, Israel numbered 630,550. Many of them died during those few months, as is the way of the world, and many completed their 20th year between Tishrei and Iyar. And it happened to work out that the number replaced exactly the number who would die. But I believe that similarity of the census does not present any question.
Okay, it's okay. So the first solution is balance. Balance. Right? Those who died were equal in number to those who had their birthday. Make sense? Possible.
Statistically, not very likely.
Statistically
Possible.
improbable. Why would it be? I mean, what would make it even more unlikely? Not just the fact that it happened to be the same number. In any given time period, which do you expect to have more of? Young people or old people? Young people. That's how, unless there is plague, catastrophe, destruction, something else, the demographics of any society look like that, with young people at the bottom and the old at the top. And you have that for a number of different reasons. One, it's because you have to be lucky to reach old age, especially in the ancient world. And even more importantly, every person can have multiple children, and so the population grows out on the bottom. There are always more in the next generation, except in modern Jewish families where we have few kids. But historically, you would have more in the lower generation compared to the number of the older generation. Therefore, it's very unlikely, not just because it's chance, but it's predetermined that there should be more young people than old people. Therefore, it's even more improbable that the numbers would work out to be exactly the same. And perhaps Ramban understood that, because he gives an additional explanation. He doesn't just stop with, it is what it is, the Popeye explanation. Onward.
But I believe that the similarity of the census does not present any question at all. For the first census included the tribe of Levi, for they had not yet been chosen and were not yet separated from the nation. While the second census were told, but the tribe of Levi you shall not count, nor shall you number their heads among the children of Israel. And those whose birthdays between the two censuses and who turned 20 during that time numbered close to 20,000.
Okay. So his second solution is to look at the precise details of how the censuses are described. And in the second census, the census that we're dealing with now, it says explicitly the Levites should not be counted in the census. So our wonderful 603,550 in Bamidbar doesn't count the Levites. But because it doesn't explicitly exclude them in the census information in the book of Exodus, that 603,550 must include them. So, follow me for a little math. You have the same 603,550 in Exodus and in Numbers. But they're not the same number. They only look the same number. So here we have our original numbers, but this includes, just a second,
That's all
includes
12
That's
tribes.
the same people.
the Levites. Whereas this one loses those that are dead, adds the new 20-year-olds, and subtracts the Levites.
Why?
You really have more people then.
So, therefore, we have, yes, a larger number of 20-year-olds, or a larger number of people coming up into the age of 20 than who died, but that's offset by the Levites being subtracted from the overall total. So by putting these numbers all together, we get our equal but not equal.
Why were the Levites excluded?
So why were the Levites excluded from the section of Bamidbar? Well, what was their job?
They weren't allowed to
Right.
be in battle.
Exactly. They were not going to be part of the mustered troops. Their defense was of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, not on the front lines, so to speak. So therefore, excluding them from this sentence makes perfect sense. If we're talking about the different jobs, they had a different job than the rest of the Israelites, therefore they shouldn't have been counted. And that allows us to make up for the surplus of 20-year-olds that would have been coming in over and above the number that had died. So now we've got two ways to account for the equality that shouldn't be equal.
It still seems strange that it came up to the same amount, the same number.
Doesn't it, though?
Yes.
Yeah, it's quite a coincidence.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, what is the answer then of those who claim the mantle of the faithful?
God is balancing things out.
Yeah, well, it's unlikely, it's improbable. It's God! I mean, manna from heaven, that's okay. Water from a rock, that's okay. But two senses coming out to be equal? I'm not sure I can buy that. No, it's God, says those who demand the title of faithful. Just because something seems unreasonable doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means it was divinely orchestrated. And which we know God can divinely orchestrate whatever God wants. And if you had faith, you'd believe that.
It's not always that you lack faith in God, you lack faith in the people who wrote this.
Let me take a little step back. So the faithful would say, but the people who wrote this are God, or is God. And they're not going to enter into a discussion about whether this was made from different texts put together, etc. And I don't think we need to go down that way to answer this. But let's back up with what you said, and instead of taking our lack of faith in God, let's take our lack of faith in our commentators and in ourselves, our own ability to understand. To say, this doesn't sound right to me, does not have to mean I don't believe God did it. It can mean I must not be reading this right. My first read, my second or third read, doesn't sit right with me. That doesn't mean that I don't believe God wrote the Torah. That doesn't mean that I don't believe God could have orchestrated it so that the numbers worked out to be exactly the same in the way that Rashi or Ramban argue. But I don't have to just to be called one of the faithful. I don't have to say that my rational instincts need to be cast off, or else I'm not considered to be faithful. I can have complete faith in the legitimacy, the accuracy, and the truth of Torah, and still say something doesn't seem right here, and I'm not happy with these explanations so far either. Now notice, it may sound like, oh, well, it's a little presumptuous of us, but isn't that what Ramban did? Ramban read Rashi and said, I am astonished. How in the world could it be? He said, okay, Rashi gave an explanation for this, and when I plug his explanation into my brain, which God gave me, it doesn't work. And I'm not going to simply say, oh, I'll have faith in Rashi and I'll have faith in God and everything must be fine. I'm going to say there's got to be a better explanation. And it's not because God is wrong. It's because I, or other humans, are in error. There is an alluring temptation to imagine that what we think the Torah says is what the Torah says. That's not always true. Our first read is not always accurate. Our second read is not always accurate. Even a read that has been understood or accepted for 500 years is not always accurate. We are deceived time and time again by believing that what we read must be what was meant. This is an illusion that's created by words on a page. When we listen to someone talking, or when we read a letter from another person, we often ask ourselves, I wonder what they meant by that. Or we often think about the implications of it, or we often try to reintegrate it into our whole understanding of that person, or our past conversations, everything else that's gone on. Yet when we read mini books, like a history book, or some other book that we consider to be not a matter of expressing something that can have feeling behind it, or something that can have meaning other than the core words, we relinquish that responsibility of trying to understand the meaning and assume the meaning is on a surface that is infinitely or instantly and universally agreeable upon. And that's not the way the Torah was written. So we keep digging. So when we read that the moon gave off light, and that doesn't sit well with us, we don't have to simply say, well, I better believe it or else I'm not considered to be truly faithful. I mean, yes, it's true. God could absolutely be causing the moon to look like it's reflecting the sunlight, but it's actually created a nimbus around it that our scientific instruments have not detected. 100% possible. God is God. God could create a situation which has fooled all of our research for the last 150, 200, actually I believe all the way down into Galileo and even other parts of the Middle Ages, they believed that the moon was reflecting light. But we could believe that it only appears to be reflecting light, but in fact it is exactly the way a simplistic, literal, in quotes, reading of the book of Genesis might lead us to believe. But we don't have to. We don't have to choose the most difficult and irrational explanation. We can find another interpretation to what does it mean to give light. Do we only say things give light if they generate the light themselves? No. We use the term to give light in all sorts of different ways, and the Torah does as well. So it's not an unreasonable or a false manipulation of the term to find another explanation. And similarly, deciding that we're still not happy with this equivalency and deciding that we want another explanation doesn't mean that we are doubting Torah. It doesn't mean that we're doubting God. We're not denying that God could have done this. We simply want the opportunity to investigate another explanation.
Do you think we make up sometimes, or whoever makes up these explanations, they make it up to equal what was said? I mean, their explanation will match the outcome.
Well, absolutely. I mean,
they struggle.
Well, of
they
course,
struggle.
we are presented, exactly. We are presented with a Torah, which is an incredibly complicated document in many ways. It's also very simple and accessible in many others, but it is also very, very complicated because it's not written in a style that we write our modern books in. And that does present certain challenges. And so, yes, when we see something that appears to be a contradiction or appears to be a problem or an illogical situation, we do struggle to reconcile it. And that comes from taking the text seriously. But just because we've come up with an explanation doesn't mean necessarily that's the only explanation. And if we're uncomfortable with that explanation, like Ramban was of Rashi's, and like Rashi was of those who simply ignored the issue, then we can go on to try and find further explanations.
Well, why would you use the word makeup?
Well, because it does feel that way sometimes, doesn't it?
Well, some,
It does feel that way. Well, come on. Two guys were, you were reading this and you realized this number and that number, and some smart aleck sat down and did the math and said, this is only like 6 months apart. What are the odds? That was a question that demanded some form of explanation. Or you simply said, it is. Well, we're not so good at just saying it is.
well, sometimes I really do feel like they go out left field to bring something in.
Okay. So absolutely there are other, what we call midrashim, other explanations of issues in the text that appear to be more geared towards using the current textual anomaly as a vehicle for another lesson. So when we talk about the idea of Abraham in Ur, and Ur seems a little odd, and the language is a little clunky, and why does it say that his brother died in front of his father's face? When the rabbis begin to expound upon that, they are absolutely using their explanation as an additional vehicle to talk about Abraham's piety and worth. And that is an additional motivation. But here, there's no additional motivation going on. They're not bringing in some great moral or ritual insight into this discussion. I mean, be honest. Have any of you ever been bothered by this before you set foot in this room? No. Probably you never noticed before you set foot in the room today.
That's it.
And even if you had noticed, would you have been bothered? Would it have become a spiritual thorn of how can I explain this and make this work? No.
It is written.
It is written. Well, Jewish tradition has said, if there's something that doesn't seem right, it's God's way of drawing our attention to something. And we don't ignore it, because ignoring it is ignoring a signpost from God. There's a wonderful phrase in rabbinic literature where they say there are certain verses that scream out darsheni, which means explain me, as though God deliberately wrote them in a way that they jump up off the page and say, look, read me carefully. I'm trying to tell you something. Don't just let your eyes slide across the column. This one doesn't scream so loudly. It's a little bit more of a whisper, because most of us glaze over with numbers. But nevertheless, there's something going on here that we might want to understand. So let's go ahead and take a look at what would probably be considered a modern interpretation. This is by Rabbi Umberto Cassuto, who was an Italian rabbi from the last part of the 19th and into the 20th century. And he's actually very famous for writing a wonderful book that attacks and seeks to undermine the whole idea that the Torah was written by many different authors. So he is a traditionalist in every sense of the word, in terms of understanding the unity and divinity of the Torah. Okay, so who'd like to be a little bit more of a modern guy?
I'll read it. As for the problem of the dates, we can solve this with what we have learned from the Mari documents, Mesopotamia, 18th century BCE, concerning the census there.
Okay, so first of all, notice. He says if you want to understand what's going on with the census, you also would be well advised to look at other ancient Near Eastern cultures' records that we've dug up in archaeology. That's okay. He's got information that Rashi and Ramban didn't have. Because Rashi and Ramban weren't doing archaeological excavations. No one was at that time.
These documents prove that a census was not a simple matter accomplished in one day, but rather took a great deal of time. We can assume that the intention of the Bible is as follows. During the first year after their exodus, when the artisans were engaged in constructing the Mishkan, the first steps of the census were taken. The Israelites appeared one by one before the designated authorities, who then wrote down their names on shards and took a half shekel from each. This money went toward the construction of the sockets in the Mishkan. After these first steps towards compiling a population registry was taken, and after the month of Nisan, dedicated to celebrating the establishment of the Mishkan and the holiday of Pesach, had passed, those in charge of the census began to sort through the list of names and to calculate totals on the first day of the second month of the second year.
Okay. How are we doing so far? So what he has said is essentially, it was one census. There were two parts to it, though. And we know, as he's pinning his explanation on, we know from other explicit ancient Near Eastern documentation, doing a census wasn't a one-day affair. It took a long time to get a count. So he says what happened is yes, they came with a shekel, but how do you know everyone gave their shekel? Because they wrote their name on a potsherd, and we have examples of potsherds with people's names on them from the ancient archaeological digs. Potsherds were the equivalent of Post-it notes in the ancient world. You broke a pot, you didn't throw the pieces away, you kept them and you used them as scrap paper. Well, not paper, scrap pottery, but you wrote on them. So people would come, they would drop their shekel in, they would give in their shard with their name. The shekels are easy to count. You just stack them up and you know how many there are. And then you can actually begin to use that silver for the construction of the Mishkan. But the potsherds, well, while everyone else was busy building the Mishkan, that would have been a much slower process. And the whole celebration and construction and everything else would have been involved with the Mishkan. Once that was done, then you begin to tally the names. Then you begin to do the named census, not simply the count of bodies census. Carry on.
Okay. As the verse says, this counting was done according to the number of their names.
Of their names.
Therefore, by counting the names written on the shards, even though several months passed between the beginning of the census and its conclusion, and in the interim some of the people counted had died, and others not counted had reached the age of counting. In any case, the number of names counted was exactly equal to the number of half shekels that had been collected earlier, since the counting in the second year was done by means of the names that had been collected at the same time as the half shekels.
So why are the two numbers the same?
The same census.
It's the same census. So we shouldn't be surprised that they're the same. We can simply say, this equals this because this is the total number of shekels. Is E before L or L before E?
Does it matter?
Yeah, well, of course it matters. Shekels, which equals names. No miracle needed. Just a little bit more understanding of what goes into taking a census in the ancient
Maybe
world.
that's why we never went into
It does make sense because they didn't have computers and they didn't have radios to tell what the totals were, and so it took a long time for the information to be gathered together.
Exactly, and they had different purposes. And one was simpler to do. The shekels you just simply stack up. And one takes a little bit more time. One you needed to do immediately for the building of the Mishkan, because you needed to know what you had for those construction purpose. The other you only needed when you began to organize people by the tribes in order to muster the troops. Because you're not going to send the shekels out to fight, you're going to send the people out to fight. So two different purposes, but the information was collected at the same time. The shekels were done, then you move on to the other. But since the others were done at the same time as the shekels, even though the count of the names happened later, it's the same information, therefore you have the same total. Now, at the time that the count of the names was done, yes, some of the names on that roster had passed away, and there were some new people who should have been added to that tally, who had turned 20, but you can't keep up with a census that way. The same way we don't in America. We don't take a census daily. We don't ask that every single organization and bureaucracy within the United States constantly send real-time data into the National Archives, letting them know exactly who's died and who's been born. We do it every 10 years. And even then we do it approximately.
Shekels, were they
there was no age limit, I mean, was it
No,
children?
the shekels were also 20 and older and men.
Oh, it was the same.
Yes. So we don't need to worry about putting the Levites in or putting the Levites out, or maybe they did include or didn't include. It can be the exact same tally with the Levites not in because they weren't going to be going into battle, and it works fine.
I think it's interesting that this opinion was formulated somewhere between 1883 and 1951. That's
Mhm.
very recent.
Yes.
So this conclusion was, I came to this conclusion very recently. So all the years up until now, there's been a discussion about why this...
Absolutely. And he didn't read Rashi and say, oh, okay. He didn't read Ramban and say, oh, okay. He didn't read all the other commentators, which I didn't bring because I like to stick to one page, and to say, oh, okay. He read them and said, there's something that doesn't quite seem right here. And the kicker, of course, is that he had access to information they didn't.
Is every part of the Torah taken apart, sentence by sentence?
Absolutely. There is commentary, at least by one person, and more than that in most cases, on every single
That would
sentence.
take thousands of volumes.
Well, it depends on how long the comment is, but yes, there's a reason why we have libraries. There's a reason why we have them. So,
There's a lot of interpretation.
Did you say this was an Italian rabbi?
yes.
Umberto?
Casuto.
Casuto?
You can look them up on Wikipedia or the Jewish Encyclopedia.
Is there a place...
But of course, most of what's on Wikipedia about Judaism came from the Jewish Encyclopedia because that's public domain. What's that?
Is there a place where all these ideas are brought so that they can be disseminated?
Right here. Not all of the ideas, but yes, there are resources to get. You can buy books that have these. Many of them are in Hebrew, but many now are also in
If
English.
you have a new idea, who would you present it to?
You'd present it to your community. When you present an idea here at the table,
You're still writing
that
books.
you are engaging in the same conversation. Now, we may not publish what we discuss here,
Right.
but we are doing exactly the same thing they did. And that's part of being part of the conversation of Judaism. We talk about being a people of the book. But when you talk about being a people of the book, it makes it sound like the book is closed. But we're the people who discuss the book, who learn from the book, and who are still contributing to our understanding of it. But why in the world would we be so arrogant to imagine that any one of us, at any one point in time, would have a perfect understanding of God's mind as expressed in the Torah, that no further explanation is necessary? Are we really so arrogant to believe that someone has gotten it right, some mortal? Now, maybe Moses, but unfortunately Moses wrote the first version. He didn't write a commentary on it.
We're still writing books, constantly. right?
Absolutely, because there's still more for us to learn. Now, some of the things that we need to learn are application of Torah into the modern world. But as what I wanted to bring today, some of the things we're learning may not have a physical application. I don't imagine anybody here's life behavior is going to be changed because the numbers, I think his theory is very sound, that the numbers are the same because it was the same census. It's not going to change the way you cook dinner. That's not going to change the way you conduct your business affairs. It's not going to change your relationship with your loved ones. But hopefully it will perhaps change your outlook on our texts and what it means to understand them and what it means to be an ongoing process of learning and understanding and what it means to be faithful and not allow others to dominate the language of faith by implying that faith is somehow the opposite of being willing to investigate and think. And if that is a little bit of a change, that you're willing to say, I have faith in the Torah, without being willing to say, and therefore I think the moon gives light, that does begin to change actually our world. Because we need people of faith who are willing to do the hard work of thinking for themselves while still listening to others. And that way faith can have a greater impact on the world as a whole. Rather than making faith some form of artificial litmus test, that you're willing to believe 10 impossible things in order to be counted as faithful, faith becomes the courage to question and understand so that we can truly come to grips, at least within our own capacity, and show the courage necessary to use what we see in this, in the world around us.
I think this proves that the interpretation of what God said may change over time because of the times we're living in.
Absolutely, or the information that's available to us. And one of the things that makes Cassuto a wonderful precursor, although he wasn't officially, of the conservative movement, is the fact that he was willing to interpret the Torah based upon exterior evidence that was gathered from historical and archaeological data. It wasn't just a matter of sitting back in a comfortable chair and thinking. He did research outside the confines into information that had been more recently brought to our attention and said, aha, that helps me understand the Torah better. And that back and forth, that we can use the world as we understand it to help us understand Torah better, and we can use the Torah to help us understand the world better, is meant to be what keeps Torah alive. Not a book that we've said we've finished and done and stick on a shelf. But we should constantly be wanting to reopen the Torah because of what we see in the world, and what we see in the Torah should constantly make us want to engage with the world in a different way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.